Donc, bonsoir. On va commencer, même si on n'est pas si nombreux que ça, mais apparemment certains de nos collègues ont eu des difficultés de voyage et donc ils vont nous rejoindre plus tard ou dans les prochains jours. Donc, on commence de toute façon. Monsieur, Mesdames, représentants des autorités dans les institutions culturelles et territoriales, Madame Betsabéas, agente de la mairie de Tours, Messieurs et Mesdames les intervenants au colloque, chers collègues, soyez les bienvenus au Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance de l'Université de Tours. Ladies and gentlemen, representative of Culture and Territorial Institution, Madame Betsabéas, Deputy Mayor, dear colleagues, it is my particular pleasure to welcome you here at the Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance for the 64th International Conference of Humanistic Studies. Je suis Elena Pierazzo, directrice du CESR. C'est pour moi un plaisir et un honneur de vous accueillir au 64e Colloque international d'études humanistes. Ça n'est d'autant plus agréable qu'il s'agit du premier colloque international d'études humanistes en présence depuis 2019. Les colloques de 2020 ont été annulés, comme plusieurs d'autres rencontres scientifiques, vous savez pourquoi. Et les colloques de 2021 se déroulaient à distance. Cette année, nous espérions intensément une rencontre en présence. Il y a eu des moments de doute, mais grâce à la détermination de tous et de toutes, et grâce aussi au ralentissement de la pandémie, même si nous assistons actuellement à une petite reprise que nous espérons modérer, nous sommes ici au rendez-vous avec un réel enthousiasme, prêt à des échanges scientifiques qui promettent d'être exceptionnels. La deuxième raison pour laquelle je suis particulièrement ravie d'être ici aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il s'agit pour moi d'une première. J'ai été nommée, il y a à peine 6 semaines, directrice au Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance de Tours. Formée à la philologie italienne de la Renaissance à l'École normale de Pise, j'ai rejoint le CESR en 2019 en tant que professeur en humanité numérique, après avoir travaillé à l'Université de Pise, au King's College London, à l'Université de Grenoble. Dès mon arrivée à Tours, j'ai repris la direction des formations en humanité numérique. La convergence entre études sur la Renaissance et les nouvelles technologies représente en fait l'une des démarches caractérisantes du CSR et qui fait de notre laboratoire l'une des institutions de pointe dans la recherche en SHS au niveau international. Je tiens ici à remercier mon prédécesseur, M. Benoît Pierre, qui a dirigé le CSR durant les 6 dernières années et qui a beaucoup contribué à ce rayonnement scientifique, particulièrement dans les domaines de la valorisation du patrimoine par le biais des outils numériques. La troisième raison pour laquelle je suis enthousiaste est liée à la thématique de ces colloques, la musique en Afrique, qui permet au CSR d'accueillir pour la première fois un grand nombre de chercheurs en provenance du continent africain. Pour cette initiative, je tiens à remercier les organisatrices de ces colloques, et notamment Camilla Cavicchi, ancienne ingénieure de recherche du CNRS au CSR, aujourd'hui et pour 3 années détachée comme professeure à l'Université de Padoue. Et Jenny Cole, de l'Université de Cape Town, representative de Africana Studies de la Renaissance Society of America, Research Officer for East Africa Recentering Afro-Asia Project. Les thématiques de ces colloques sont singulièrement significatives pour nous. Elles démontrent la dimension internationale de notre centre, mais aussi son ouverture disciplinaire et scientifique qui dépasse la définition classique de Renaissance, sans l'oublier ni la banaliser. Je reviendrai sur ce point plus tard. Certains d'entre vous viennent pour la première fois au centre de la Renaissance. Je me permets donc un détour historique institutionnel que je vous promets sera très bref. Le Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance a été fondé en 1956 à l'initiative de Gaston Berger, philosophe et directeur de l'enseignement supérieur, qui en confié à la direction à Pierre Ménard de 1956 à 1969, une de ses personnalités marquantes. Leurs idées étaient de fonder en France un centre interdisciplinaire de dimension internationale consacré à l'étude de la civilisation de la Renaissance. La place de la Renaissance dans le Val-de-Loire est particulièrement en Touraine, tant que du point de vue architectural, vous pouvez penser au château d'Amboise, d'Azay-les-Rideaux, de Chenonceau, de Chambord, etc., que d'un point de vue littéraire et artistique. Et ici, on pense à Rabelais, Descartes, Ockeghem, Bourtichon, Colombe. Cette prééminence n'a pas été étrange, en fait, au choix de Tours pour la création du Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance. La Renaissance représente ainsi en Indre-et-Loire une période fondamentale dont la connaissance approfondie est particulièrement riche d'enseignements. La ville de Tours met donc à disposition du CSR un bâtiment nommé l'Hôtel de Camours, le nom de son propriétaire du XIXe siècle. En ce moment, nous sommes sur le site d'Étanneur, siège des facultés des sciences humaines, à 5 minutes à pied du CSR. Et à la fin de la conférence de professeur Herman Bennett, nous vous guiderons jusqu'au centre où vous attend un cocktail de bienvenue. À partir de demain, les colloques se déroulera entièrement au CSR. Et vous aurez donc la possibilité d'apprécier la particularité des lieux, sa tour médiévale, ses passages secrets, ses vitraux, ses livres et tout ce qui rend cette maison spéciale. Les travaux scientifiques du CSR s'organisent autour de 5 axes scientifiques et de 7 programmes thématiques. Les axes sont déployés thématiquement, comme dans le cas de la recherche en humanité numérique, de manière transversale pour savoir, théorie, pratique, circulation, l'axe les arts performatifs, la culture de l'image, l'axe culture de la pluralité religieuse et politique. Et enfin, des matières spécifiques avec un axe qui se déroule autour de la Renaissance en Val-de-Loire. Les programmes de recherche, quant à eux, ont été pensés pour répondre aux spécificités du CSR et des évolutions scientifiques à l'échelle régionale, nationale et européenne. Ces programmes sont déployés autour des sources de musique du XIVe, XVe, XVIe siècle, Richard Carr, du livre ancien de la littérature, la bibliothèque virtuelle humaniste, de la musique baroque avec le Centre de la musique baroque de Versailles, d'un programme RC sur les arts performatifs qui s'appelle Performart, des traités d'architecture, Architectura, et des transmissions de textes et de savoirs, Europa Humanistica, et des patrimoines culturels et naturels, Intelligence des patrimoines. Nos projets sont financés eux aussi à l'échelle régionale, nationale et internationale. Et ici, je me permets de souligner particulièrement les programmes Richard Carr, qui s'occupe des sources musicales, qui est l'organisateur principal du colloque qui nous réunit ici aujourd'hui, et qui a récemment remporté des projets prestigieux, dont un programme COST européenne axé sur la musique ancienne, et un projet en partenariat avec l'Université de Berkeley en Californie. Je salue ici son directeur, M. Philippe Vandrix. Les CSR constituent à la fois un lieu d'enseignement pluridisciplinaire en histoire, histoire de l'art, histoire des sciences et techniques, littérature, musicologie et philosophie, assurant la préparation à des masters, doctorats et habilitations dirigées de recherche. Mais il y a aussi un centre d'études, comme vous avez compris. Il réunit une cinquantaine de chercheurs et universitaires de toutes ces disciplines et autant de doctorants attachés à l'analyse de la civilisation de la Renaissance, avec les concours d'une trentaine de collaborateurs et ingénieurs techniciens et administratifs. Un centre d'études est un organisme vivant, en constant renouvellement scientifique et disciplinaire, et le CSR ne fait pas exception. La Renaissance ici représente une sorte de synopie de laquelle rayonne un intérêt tout particulier pour l'étude du patrimoine matériel, immatériel et naturel. Le CSR est associé avec d'autres laboratoires de recherche en archéologie, l'équipe laboratoire archéologie et territoire de l'UMR Citer par exemple, en informatique avec l'équipe LIFAT et en sciences d'alimentation avec sa relation avec l'Institut européen d'histoire et de culture de l'alimentation de la Villa Rabelais. Dans une dimension résolument interdisciplinaire au croisement de 3 domaines scientifiques majeurs, les sciences humaines, les sciences du patrimoine, donc culture et patrimoine de la Renaissance, et les sciences du numérique. Depuis quelques mois, les 2 composantes du CSR, la recherche et l'enseignement, sont dirigées par 2 personnes qui travaillent en binôme, partageant les mêmes lieux, les mêmes objectifs et les enjeux scientifiques. J'aurais souhaité à ce point laisser la parole à la directrice de l'UFR, c'est-à-dire la composante pédagogique du CSR, Mme Marion Baudon-Machuel, mais elle est malheureusement positive à la Covid et donc empêchée de joindre à nous. Je vous transmets ces salutations les plus chaleureuses et s'associe à moi pour vous souhaiter une semaine riche et inspirante d'échanges scientifiques et de création de liens au-delà des langues, des cultures et des frontières. Je ne vais pas abuser davantage de votre patience et je donc laisse la parole aux deux organisatrices, Camilla Cavicchi et Jeanne Cole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, chère Elena. Merci pour cette introduction et merci aussi à Marion pour sa présence ici, disons, dans nos esprits. Chers collègues, je vous remercie pour votre présence également. Avec Jenny, nous sommes très contentes d'avoir pu organiser ce colloque et nous présenterons brièvement le cadre épistémologique qui a donné vie à cette initiative en répondant à deux questions. Pourquoi organiser un colloque sur la musique en Afrique dans la première époque moderne? Et ensuite, pourquoi l'organiser au CESR de Tours? Dans le domaine de la musique de la Renaissance, les musicologues travaillent principalement sur des sources écrites, qu'elles soient musicales, historiques, figuratives, ainsi que des objets, des architectures, des manuscrits, des instruments de musique, afin de documenter les pratiques et la vie musicale dans les cours et les villes européennes. Dans mon travail d'historienne de la musique, j'ai dédié mes recherches à cette culture écrite de l'élite, mais aussi aux traditions orales des autres acteurs et en particulier des minorités et des marginaux, c'est-à-dire des musiciens porteurs de la culture subalterne, tels les chantres de rue, les cantastorie, les joueurs de fifre et tambour, les barbiers, les aveugles, les ambulants, etc. Souvent négligée par l'historiographie musicale qui est par nature eurocentrique et focalisée sur le concept esthétique d'œuvres d'art musicales, d'œuvres d'art musical propres de la culture des élites, ces marginaux eurent pourtant un impact significatif sur la création, la transmission et la transformation des répertoires entre les différents groupes sociaux à l'époque moderne. Il y a une trentaine d'années, Franco Alberto Gallo et Roberto Leidi, professeurs à l'Université de Bologne, ont publié des réflexions fondamentales pour la construction de cette perspective qu'aujourd'hui plusieurs d'entre nous partagent. En particulier, l'autre musique, ethnomusicologie de Roberto Leidi, publiée en 1991, a marqué les esprits de centaines d'étudiants à réfléchir sur la musique des autres, à considérer l'oralité comme une dimension essentielle des traditions écrites, à intégrer l'approche anthropologique et ethnomusicologique à l'approche historique et vice-versa. Parmi les minorités de l'Europe de la Renaissance, les Africains, leur musique, leurs danses, leurs instruments apparaissent couramment. Leur présence est constante dans les danses, les musiques écrites, les chroniques, les récits des voyages, les enluminures, les fresques, les sculptures, les traités, les documents d'archives, les effectifs des musiciens recrutés dans les cours ou dans les municipalités, les pratiques dévotionnelles. Cependant, l'état de l'art sur la musique en Afrique et hors de l'Afrique reste lacunaire. De même, si les travaux de Leidi et d'autres prédécesseurs ont ouvert la voie à la recherche sur l'influence des Africains et de leurs pratiques musicales en Europe, peu d'études musicales se sont concentrées sur la musique dans les différentes parties de l'Afrique au début de la période moderne, sans aucune relation avec l'Europe, c'est-à-dire au-delà d'une perspective eurocentrique. Tous les indices que nous croisons méritent d'être analysés, compris dans leur contexte, mis en valeur et transmis dans nos enseignements. Nous ne pouvons plus fermer les yeux devant la richesse des sources sur les traditions musicales dans les continents africains. Et il s'avère nécessaire de comprendre leur impact sur les cultures des autres continents, de l'Inde aux Amériques à l'Europe. Les travaux des chercheurs ici réunis, que nous écouterons dans les jours à suivre, légitiment notre souhait d'accorder une place importante à ce domaine dans la musicologie historique de la Renaissance et nous encouragent à écrire une nouvelle histoire de la musique à l'époque moderne. La pluralité de nos horizons de recherche, l'acceptation de la perspective méthodologique de l'autre discipline, la suspension de la vision eurocentrique et blanche, Le croisement des méthodologies de l'histoire, de l'iconographie, de l'organologie, de l'ethnomusicologie, de l'archéologie, de l'histoire de l'art, de l'histoire des sciences, l'implication non seulement des chercheurs affirmés, mais aussi des jeunes chercheurs, un master ou un doctorant, qui sont réunis également dans ce colloque, offre, il nous semble aujourd'hui, un terrain particulièrement fertile et prometteur. Je passe la parole à ma collègue Jenny Cole qui va continuer cette argumentation concernant l'aspect épistémologique de notre colloque.
Merci beaucoup Camilla. Mesdames, Messieurs, bonsoir. Our landmark conference also aims to explore much wider epistemological and methodological questions in terms of global knowledge production, its validity and scope, terminology, the recent global turn, decoloniality, and how these might impact early music studies centered on Africa, its diaspora, and African musical influences in the wider early modern world. And we have a roundtable and workshop dedicated to these themes also. The term early music generally refers to the study and performance of European music from the medieval period to circa 1750. This standard exclusive terminology is clearly problematic when considering the vast early histories of music making, cultural practices and repertories in the same chronological time frame in geographical locations outside of Europe. The idea of a global early music history aims to provide a fuller picture of music making during these time periods, both within, related to, and especially beyond Europe. Musical change and development, that is, music history in the broadest sense, in counterpart to stasis, are of course the hallmarks of every music culture. As Olivia Blurkle puts it, if we start with the premise that significant musical change likely occurred in some form in all regions of the early modern world, then how does this alter conventional music historical narratives and perspectives where Western music scholarship has tended to overemphasize change in the West and stasis everywhere else? The term early modern itself also remains problematic in terms of perpetuating a Eurocentric notion of human history, even though historians have used this term since the 1970s as a substitute for Eurocentric and elitist periodizations of world history with terms such as Renaissance and Baroque. It may, as Wilburn and Kuzik point out, make little sense for music history in African contexts of the same time period unless it involved European contact. Another problem remains the binary opposition between stasis and change as correspondingly linked to the categories of traditional and modern, which derived from 19th century social history and went hand in hand with colonial rule, designating the traditional as incapable of change and thus outside of history, while modern signified change, progression, and was historical. So what implications might these social binaries, which ascribe the capacity to change to some societies and not to others, and continue to inform contemporary social and political theorizing, have for early music histories grounded in Africa's past? The challenge lies in evaluating which musical changes are significant in a wider global panorama, which then involves questions of value, scale, and perspective, inclusivity and exclusivity in global knowledge, and also uneven allocations of power in a north-south binary in deciding these questions and writing these histories. The reality of the early modern world was a merging of cultural realms of the African and the European, the Americas, and the Indian Ocean world, and interconnected music histories and flows of change which were a universal quality of human societies. Moving past the notion of traditional Africa, as V.Y. Mudimbe articulates, allows for more nuanced interpretations that acknowledge the complexity of interactions between peoples and their music histories across continents during this period, as our conference aims to explore. The story of early globalization, and by extension music's place in it, is partly one of European integration into a pre-existing Afro-Asian interregional system of trade and slave networks, not vice versa, and therefore the importance of Africa's centrality for a global music history of this period cannot be overstated, including musical modernity in this process, which, as Blurkle emphasizes, upends the conventional Western narrative of modernity as issuing almost exclusively from Europe. Moreover, the silences and distortions of the colonial archive represent a difficult historiographical problem for music scholars, with a general neglect of indigenous and diasporic African musical lives and practices in early music histories due to their marginalization or perceived absence in sources. This further points to the validity of oral traditions concerning indigenous knowledge systems as legitimate source, and neglected African written sources in tandem with the colonial archive, with all its limitations and possibilities, to explore the long history of entanglements and musical migrations between Africa and the Indian Ocean world long before European intervention, and the centrality of Africans to musical modernity in Europe. A global turn and radical non-centrism, as we might call it, may lead to a coloniality of sorts in early music studies, as Chakrabarti calls musicology's recent global application of the early modern to music studies a, quote, democratizing move, unquote, driven by a desire to equalize world historiography. By rethinking how sonic and embodied practices can be focused on indigenous knowledge systems and neglected voices and communities, centering more voices on the global south in the study of Africa, for example, and moving away from traditional narratives limited by Eurocentric paradigms, we may reconstruct Africa's musical developments on an indigenous platform that speak to Africa's early modern musical past that has until now remained largely misrepresented or entirely unexplored. We hope that our conference is only the beginning in building a community of scholars to collaborate with other international study groups, such as the Renaissance Society of America's Africana Studies, the International Musicological Society Study Group on Global History of Music, and research groups on travel diaries at the University of Padova, and the International Council of Traditional Music Study Group on African Musics, and other possible institutions in Europe, Africa, and elsewhere.
Thanks, Janie. Alors, je vais répondre à les deux questions. Donc, on a répondu à la première question. Et là, maintenant, on répond à la deuxième question. Pourquoi organiser un colloque sur la musique d'Afrique au CESR de Tours? Depuis 1992, Richard Carr, le programme de recherche en musicologie du Centre d'études supérieures de la Renaissance de Tours, qui est dirigé par Philippe Vandrix, s'investit dans de nombreux domaines cultivant des approches multidisciplinaires, de l'analyse musicale aux humanités numériques, de l'histoire sociale de la musique à l'iconographie musicale, à l'organologie, à la recherche expérimentale sur les pratiques musicales, à l'archéologie acoustique, à la construction de réseaux internationaux visant à consolider des collaborations européennes et transatlantiques sur la musique de la Renaissance. Richard Carr fête ces années ses 30 ans, et lorsque j'étais ingénieur à Richard Carr, il m'a paru naturel que ce programme se fasse promoteur d'un colloque sur la musique en Afrique et sur sa diffusion dans le monde durant la première époque moderne. Après 30 ans de travail assidu sur la musique de la Renaissance européenne, le CESR offre un cadre propice pour faire naître et pour porter cette nouvelle initiative. L'organisation de ce colloque n'a pas été facilitée par les événements sanitaires et politiques de ces dernières années. Alors la Covid a fait reporter en 2020 ce colloque à cette année, mais elle est devenue ensuite un obstacle pour la participation des chercheurs provenant des pays où les vaccins ne sont pas disponibles, en particulier de l'Afrique. Puis, malgré nos efforts pour financer les voyages des jeunes chercheurs provenant de l'Afrique, la hausse vertigineuse des prix des vols provoquée au printemps dernier par la guerre en Ukraine nous a empêchés d'aider tous les chercheurs qu'on aurait souhaité aider. Et enfin, suite à des problèmes au sein des ambassades de France en Afrique, les chercheurs n'ont pas obtenu leur visa pour nous rejoindre à Tours. Donc nous en sommes navrés de cette situation assez compliquée. Mais cette sous-section de faits témoigne également du travail important encore à faire pour faciliter les collaborations entre l'Europe et l'Afrique. Pour finir, nous souhaitons remercier d'abord les institutions qui ont financé ces colloques, l'Université de Tours, le CNRS, le ministère de la Culture, le programme Richard Carr, la région Centre-Val de Loire. Nous remercions l'équipe efficace du CESR qui a passionnément travaillé à nos côtés pendant cette année, Marie-Laure Masquillet, chargée de la gestion administrative de l'UMR, Hervé Landuré, Sandrine Vicente, Alexandra Magne de l'antenne financière, Alice Nuet, responsable de la cellule d'édition et créatrice des magnifiques visuels là, qu'on voit aujourd'hui et que vous trouvez aussi dans vos dossiers. Et elle a fait un travail vraiment excellent, magnifique, et je la remercie particulièrement. Enfin, nous remercions Concetta Penuto, maître de conférence en histoire de la médecine, et les bibliothécaires du CESR qui ont organisé une petite et très jolie exposition des imprimés du fonds ancien du CESR sur l'Afrique que vous pourrez visiter dans les jours à venir pendant le colloque. Donc, dans la bibliothèque, il y a 2 vitrines avec ces magnifiques exemplaires qui font partie de la réserve du CESR. Et donc, merci à vous toutes et tous. Nous sommes maintenant très heureuses et honorées d'inviter M. Herman Bennett, professeur à la City University de New York et directeur de l'Institute for Research of the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean. Et M. Bennett est un spécialiste de la diaspora africaine des débuts de l'ère moderne et auteur de plusieurs ouvrages tels que Roi africain, esclave noir, souveraineté des possessions de l'Atlantique à l'époque moderne, La négritude coloniale, une histoire afro-mexicaine, Les Africains dans le Mexique colonial, absolutisme, chrétienté et conscience afro-créole, La diaspora africaine, une courte introduction. Chacun de ces ouvrages a marqué la communauté des historiens par l'originalité de ses approches, l'exploration des thématiques inédites et un sens exceptionnel de la narration. Il ouvrira ce colloque avec une conférence sur leçons du pouvoir, reconnaître l'autorité souveraine dans les textes européens du début de l'ère moderne. Merci beaucoup, cher Herman, d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Merci.
Bonsoir. I want to begin by thanking my hosts, Camilla Cavici and Jenny Cole and Philippe Vendry, and the university and your association. And I want to also thank everybody that contributed to this conference, including making such a wonderful poster. And I want to also thank the people who set up today's presentation, the tables, the organization, the electricity, everything that goes into making our lives as thinkers, as scholars and writers possible. We exist and coexist, and so we are very thankful for all that you have done to make this happen. I would like to also thank all the participants. I look forward to hearing your talks over the next few days, to hearing your conversation, to learning from you and thinking with you. The titles are really inviting, and so it is such an honor to be here today to open up this conference. So I'm going to do this in a few parts. So this talk, I want to start off with let us begin with an iconic representation of the 15th century European encounter with Africa. Caramansa, and it's a direct quote, and I want us to stay with this, and I'm going to explain to you what I'm going to do here. But I want you to listen to this, and if I speak too fast, I've been living in New York for a very long time. I'm married to a New Yorker, and the way we speak is increasingly getting faster and faster and faster, and it manifests itself in how we speak and how we read. Caramansa came with many people in a warlike manner, with a great hubbub of kettle drums, trumpets, bells, and other instruments, more deafening than pleasing to the ear. Their dress was their own flesh, anointed and very shining, which made their skins still blacker, a custom which they affected as elegancy. Their privy parts, their private parts, only were covered with the skins of monkeys or woven palm leaves. The chiefs with patterned cloth, which they had from our ships. All, in general, were armed after their manner, some with spears and others with bucklers or swords, others with bows and quivers of arrows. And many, in place of helmets, wore monkey skins studded with the teeth of the animals. Those who were considered noblemen were followed by 2 pages, one of whom carried a round wooden stool so that they might sit down and rest when they wished. The other, a war buckler. These noblemen wore rings and golden jewels on their heads and beards. Their king, Caramansa, came in their midst, his legs and arms covered with golden bracelets and rings, a collar around his neck from which hung small bells, and in his plaited beard, golden bars which weighed down his untrimmed hair, with some which hung small bells which weighted down his untrimmed hair so that instead of being twisted, it was smooth. To impress his dignity, he walked very slow and light steps, never turning his face from side to side. João Barros, the chronicler, Portuguese chronicler. So I ask you to stay with this image and soundscape engendered by many people in warlike manner with a great hubbub of kettle drums, trumpets, bells, and other instruments, end quote. As I move on to framing and contextualizing this fragment presented both by the Portuguese chronicler João Barros and his contemporary Rui de Penha, also a 15th century Portuguese chronicler. In the talk itself, I return to this representative fragment. I return to this representative fragment again, but here now, I merely wish to pose the following question. How might we approach descriptions of spectacles and ceremonies, those ritualized aesthetic and sonic encounters that I want to suggest at the outset represented political signifiers that divulge the existence of African sovereignty? How do we approach these spectacles and ceremonies? Ceremonial performances, writes Lawrence Bryant, a historian of early modern France, were the heart of political life. For this reason, notes Bryant, much of late medieval and early 16th century public history consists of chronicles and lists of ranks, meeting places, forms of address, and procedures in a vast number of ceremonial assemblies, end quote. Through textual production, scribes, chroniclers, and court historians brought into relief early modern political culture, and with it, the early modern state. An analogous reading animates the methodological approach adopted here. Mining these familiar accounts and passages through, though composed by Europeans, offers sites of and the production of silences of distinct political cultures and the associated state forms. Thus the title of the talk, The Sound of Power, Acknowledging Sovereign Authority in Early Modern Text. The Sound of Power. Years ago, on entering Portugal's National Archive, an exhibit of early modern exploration caught my eye. It was 1998, 6 years after Spain had commemorated the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage. Perusing the contents of the exhibit, one could not but notice the scrolls, papyri, embellished and laminated text, announcing far more than just the vastness of Portuguese exploration. The Portuguese court received the inhabitants of North and Eastern Africa, West Central Africa, the Middle East, South and East Asia as notables. Dignitaries who, on delivering their respective sovereigns' correspondence, enjoyed the protective status of emissaries. In this reenactment of Renaissance diplomacy, the various texts on display reflect a rhetorical protocol steeped in innate forms of address. They stood and spoke as equals, a status conveyed by lords, emirs, negos, emperors, pashas, manicangos, and princes through the detailed invocation of royal titles. Pressed for time, I pushed on and into the archive, but not before a long look at the letters crafted in Amharic that Ethiopia's rulers addressed to his Christian brother and peer, the Portuguese sovereign. The conventional representations shared by contemporary Africans and their global descendants regarding the early modern European encounter with the larger world is troubled by this correspondence. It's troubled. We are not accustomed to seeing Europeans according Africans this kind of diplomatic respect. In the popular narrative, defined by conquest, colonial exploitation, colonial imposition, possession, and dispossession, what role, if any, did this correspondence, saturated with royal titles, play? If titles did not matter, why were all the parties involved constantly utilizing them, invoking them, making allegations and charges of respect for those titles? In the eyes of the Europeans, what functions did they serve? And how might these titles reveal something different about a well-known past, typified by the easy juxtaposition or the easy contrast of conquerors and conquered, winners and victims, colonizers and colonized, masters and slaves? Our foundational premise, indeed our foundational thinking, surrounding these juxtaposition or contrast resides in the abject and violated black body of the enslaved, an object unmoored and alienated from all pre-existing social ties. Objectification, always already conceived as secular in form, does not produce inquiry or lead to inquiry into a previous status, much less to an exploration of a moment seemingly defined by mutual recognition of the importance of diplomatic protocol. The history of slavery, yes, the history of slavery forecloses an engagement with the past, as it constitutes the slave as an epistemic object of the here, the now, and future. Simply stated, a master was a master and a slave was a slave. We need not explore and think more carefully about it. Or perhaps we need to. Language matters. And as historians of Africans, I was keen on knowing if the use of royal terminology in the text was more than just a dismissive gesture of African clownishness and culpability. I felt compelled to ask whether these descriptions were related to a grammar of politics that perhaps informed both Europe's encounter with Africa and subsequent histories that unfolded. Further, what role, if any, did the acknowledged existence of the political play in Africa play in shaping articulations of statecraft in Europe? To which a final question or a related question was attached or appended. How might this political grammar be illustrative of pasts that have been lost to us under the subsequent weight of successive colonial impositions and our restricted political imagination. I used the existence and the terminology of the letters as a starting point and soon understood that the pervasiveness with which European chroniclers and travel writers employed Iberian royal tropes described the earliest encounters with Africans. Royalty saturated the landscape. And with this awareness, I have re-immersed myself in the familiar travel logs and chroniclers, which many of you are talking about over the next couple of days, describe the European encounter with Africa. It is immediately clear that the terminology forms a corpus, a register, if you will, questioning the idea of a hermetically sealed European ascendancy, one from which the slave trade emerged and devolved into the absence of political negotiations, driven only by force and commodification, in which tenuous relations were market-driven. In pondering this ubiquitous use of royal terminology, I'm asking, how might one read this phenomenon of this acknowledgement of African sovereignty that was simultaneously constitutive or simultaneously engendering of an early modern imperial state, an early modern European Iberian statecraft? Though my focus on the Europeans' pervasive deployment of royal terminology in reference to African sovereignty, I intentionally rely on narrative literature composed of chronicles and travel logs that has been foundational to framing the earliest European or the earliest encounter between Africans and Europeans. In the extant or the existing documents, familiar, and I think I want to hear this, familiar to the point of being overlooked, it is possible to glimpse traces of a past that tacked between African and European history, which begs for a reconsideration of the early modern African diaspora, Atlantic history, and the New World's origin story of blackness. The interpretive practice of rereading, and I guess that's a part of the method here, the interpretive practice of rereading the early modern colonial library as opposed to the colonial archive for evidence, understandings, and events complicating the inaugural moments of European expansion engenders an origin story still in need of being conceived, and that has implications for how our future past will unfold. While the narrative of slavery and freedom stood on the horizon, a strategic rereading of the early modern colonial library also questions truths bequeathed to us from a subsequent liberal era that to this day still colonizes our imaginary when it comes to framing the 15th century European encounter with Africa. Such truths include the idea of a progression from Nicolas Machiavelli, Jean Baudin, and Thomas Hobbes, that Europeans alone begat European states, especially at a distance and with an indifference to the experience of Africa and Africans, and that race was foundational in the African-European encounter, and that commodification was always ascendant in that encounter. Stated less abstractly, the European encounter with Africa is generally not seen as a site of theorization with regard to the political. But the political informs every text of this encounter. Rhetoric and performances of lordship, soundscapes alongside the legal regime, ceremonies and pomp are constitutive of early modern politics, both in the form of sovereign power and sovereignty. Scholars of the slave trade and empire usually look at these as anecdotes, at best curiosities in that figure and cultural history, as exceptional instances that are relegated to a curiosity in favor of data or abstraction in the service of telling the predictable story of slavery's ascendance. Soundscapes as you, the assembled here, know, often get reduced or positioned as the ethnomusical rather than as the musical, the beauty and brilliance rendered and mediated through the oral form and as constitutive feature of power. I'm intent on reading the rhetoric and to a lesser extent, sound and incidents and ceremonies and rituals embedded in the chronicles and travel accounts as political tropes. These tropes, as anecdotes, prominently manifest in the well-worn tomes of the colonial library, demand an equally valid reading of the colonial past as it relates to Africa, Africans, and the formation of the African diaspora. Let us turn to one of these tales that emerges from the colonial library to bring it down to the ground a little bit. It ends with a murder, the murdering of an African prince. But to focus on that alone ignores the details that speaks to the spectacles of politics. In 1488, soon after the Abyssinian priest Lucas Marcos left the court of João II, another Ethiopian delegation landed in João's realm. On learning of the Prince Bemoi's arrival from Senegal, João instructed his officials to escort the prince and his entourage of nobles. The prince and nobles, those are the terms that are embedded in the text, and relatives to an estate just beyond Lisbon. There, in anticipation of his audience with Portugal's sovereign, Bemoy was treated in every respect as a sovereign lord, not as a barbarous prince outside of the law, end quote. As the chronicles of this visit continue, we are treated to what European medievalists refer to as Assemblies of the King, a list and descriptions that convey a lot about politics and court life, the exact details of gestures, the exact manifestations of the ritualizing process, the move of the Portuguese sovereign, the gesture in response of the African prince, the attendance of the household, and the ways in which they were assembled, that of the nobles that accompanied Bemoy, the hand gesture, the arm, the embrace, the requesting of not to bow, but to sit beside oneself, including also the presence of the musicians, the presence of the entire court that had been assembled. And here the simple point is, this is something that is not a radical discovery. This is something that's actually, as some of you hopefully are talking about in the next couple of days, these are kinds of things that we find with everyday, these are like almost everyday evidence in the records. We see this with such ease. But if our vision and our horizon and our thinking takes us already to the story of what we know is going to happen in the 18th century or in the 17th century, we lose sight of that gesture of the Portuguese king and a Senegalese prince standing side by side, embracing the gesture, which hand leads, which hand receives, which hand, the full-bodied, the embodied histories that are being enacted there, including the ways in which the court performs itself, and the entourages perform themselves and are staged in this process. So allow me to follow one narration of a spectacle with another. In 1441, building on years of previous Portuguese trading, hunting, and fishing expeditions that scoured the Atlantic coastline south of Cape Bajador, a small fleet of caravels, ships anchored at Lagos on the Portuguese coast. As the returning crew discharged their cargo in the presence of the Infante Dom Henrique, popularly known as Henry the Navigator, the spectacle of a handful of captives drew the attention of the royal party. Though few in number, the captives sparked expectations. And recalling this event and anticipating the future it foretold, the royal chronicler Gomes de Zurara speculated about royal sentiment. Quote, "He felt joy," end quote, Zoraida conjectured about the prince's reaction, not so much for the number of captives taken, as for the hope of the others that would be taken. In projecting royal will, the chronicler envisioned how the prince's imagination or imaginary transformed captives into slaves while conjuring a robust slave trade into existence. Zoraida was quick, however, to add that the prince was not unduly focused on the wealth accruing from the future trade in slaves. Thy joy, observed the chronicler, was solely from that one holy purpose to seek salvation for the lost souls of the heathen. Enslavement afforded the captives salvation and true freedom, end quote. And yet, wrote the chronicler, the greater benefit was theirs, for though their bodies were now brought into subjection, that was a small matter in comparison to their souls, which now possess true freedom forevermore, end quote. One can easily dismiss Zoraida's musings about the soul, salvation, and true freedom as ideology at work, which in fact it was. But an undue focus on ideology privileges secular skepticism at the expense of faith, reduces Christianity simply to an instrument of power, and has caused scholars to lose sight of Catholicism's formidable yet layered political history with Africa and Africans. There's an iconic image of the slave trade in which a solitary priest baptized enslaved masses of Africans as their captors compelled them on board. And while scholarship on the Catholic encounter has transcended this image, we need to grapple carefully with what it meant then. Catholic missions, though sparse, were an established reality in a number of 16th century West and West Central African kingdoms. And I believe there's a number of you who are talking about the Kingdom of Congo in the next couple of days, so I'm looking forward to attending that session as well. And while the earliest missions, especially among the Congo people, the Bakongo peoples, have attracted scholarly attention, we still have yet to fully consider Christianity's institutional and intellectual complexity, which sanctioned the presence of the priest and insinuated Catholicism into Africa. Even if we concede the limited role that the church's conscience played, in this process, one needs to also ponder the efficacy of scripture, theology, papal nuncios, the particulars of church-state relations, and Christian relations with the extra ecclesiam. To acknowledge the iconic imagery of a priest and his gestures were superficial should not foreclose an examination of the institutional mechanisms and intellectual traditions that mediated the Catholic encounter with Africa and Africans. Doing so requires that we understand that in the eyes of the church, the priest's presence transcended the issues of the Christian conscience. Catholicism was a manifestation of statecraft. Church-state relations, theology, papal authority, papal bulls, church canons, and canon law all came to the fore when medieval Christians encountered infidels or pagans, and for that matter, the extra ecclesiam. In overlooking Catholicism's institutional history and its related intellectual currents, we lose sight or have lost sight of a tradition of Christian politics that brought into relief the simultaneity of an early modern African and European sovereignty, which perhaps offers a more complicated explanation for why the priest stood at the key or at the port. Here I want to suggest how and under what circumstances Catholic dogma, institutions, and law mattered in the European encounter with Africans. This history magnifies a field of politics concerning early modern sovereignty that culminated in a taxonomy of African difference, which in turn rendered the inhabitants of some polities, not all polities, some polities into slaves. Even prior to the systemization of the slave trade and slavery, which only 2 centuries later would be firmly linked with people of African descent. 2 centuries later from this particular moment, we see how Christianity mediated encounters with pagan polities. These encounters were marked not by a confident reliance on European superiority, but rather on mutual recognition that navigated such encounters, that such encounters required careful diplomacy. Such maneuvers shaped both the encounter itself, but also the self-conscious performances of state power on both sides of the encounter. To say as much calls into question the teleos that has long served to absorb the African-European encounter and its immediate history into the story of New World slavery, thereby overlooking the part that Africa and Africans played in the evolution of Iberian sovereignty and imperial identity prior to 1492. Scholars rarely reflect on the earliest sequence of events, Iberians interacting with African polities, and how that history might trouble the existing narrative of the West and its emergence. Indeed, the emphasis has been on the inauguration of the slave trade and slavery, and how the slave trade unfolds in the economic and social histories of the Americas. The iconic yet imaginary priest location symbolically delineating the boundaries between an African polity and the beginnings of Christian jurisdiction is tenuous. Yet we need to note his location. His presence points to a site of metamorphosis, a place where elites, buyers, and owners reduced Africans into slaves. This is a sleight of hand quite familiar to scholars of slavery and the slave trade. After all, the trade signified the existence of sovereign authority, both African and European, which in turn highlighted an often overlooked Christian intellectual and institutional legacy, which like the imaginary priest's presence, scholars in popular lore usually reduce to ideological contortions, right? Christian colonialism. In reducing the earliest encounter with Africa to the slave trade and slavery, we have lost sight of a distinct narrative of power in Africa in which Africans stood for far more than objects acted upon. Right? And that's one of the takeaways here. Right? Sort of thinking about the question of how do we move beyond the question or the issue of object and the location, and thinking from the perspective of object. What I'm arguing here, however, is not an assertion of African agency. And I want to be clear about that. I'm not arguing for a perspective. I'm instead interested in the implications that this past might have for narrating the history of Europe. And I will say something later perhaps about agency, but I just assume that agency by definition is what it means to be human. That there's not a need to ascribe or to discover or to invent or to impose or to recognize African agency. That is by definition what one sees in those performances, or even when mediated and narrated by Europeans. The narrative of power historians and theorists associated with the West has woefully under-examined and under-theorized the African presence. There's no question about that. This presence, I argue, comprises a site yet to be examined for its role in Western formation, a history in which Africa and Africans figured as objects, yes, but occasionally also emerged as historical subjects. In the hands of scholars whose eyes are fixed on the emergence of the slave trade, Africa and Africans rarely emerge from the earliest histories of the Portuguese and Spanish past beyond the status of chattel already detached from what in modern terms might be described as political economy. Consequently, the objects of the slave trade and slavery enter history, that is the European past, devoid of any claims, ties, and associations that position them as subjects, clients, and vassals of African lords and elites whose own status fluctuated over time. From this perspective, it is easy to imagine and project natal alienation or social death as a timeless phenomenon rather than as a dramatic and historicized act involving force and violence that rendered roots into rootlessness. What is more, we ascribe a hegemonic singularity to the early European past. Despite what we fully know to be the role of the Catholic Church and Christian ideology in the encounter, Europe in its relationship to Africa is always already rendered a secular and dominant, fully forged entity with a singular political rationale. Europe in this configuration of the past is already the West rather than, gotta work on that, is already the West rather than an entity or idea that emerges in and through its encounters with Africa, right? And so I want you guys to think about that a little bit, right? And we all we need to, that continues to be one of the single most important parts of our ways of which we need to theorize, conceptualize, and also to think about how to write other future pasts so that we can actually move outside of sort of this kind of hegemonic understanding that Europe and Africa emerge fully formed in these encounters as agents and objects, as conquerors and conquered, right? And so that we can actually begin to think for other kinds of possibilities at different moments, especially these moments of encounters here in the 15th and early 16th century, right? Knowing full well that the story of the 18th century is still to come, but that we don't get there just through a particular kind of teleology. And that allows for an opening of things, of political possibilities, ways in which to imagine worlds that have simply been lost to us. And I believe that those worlds are the worlds that many of you in this room are seeking to make claims for and are seeking to find opportunities and openings to be able to think and conceptualize and to produce a different kind of understandings of the past and therefore and enable different understandings of the present and futures. From these aforementioned observations flow an assertion. Until Europe is understood in its historical specificity, neither its early modern encounter with Africa nor Africa's encounter with Europe can be fully realized. We understand the unrelenting violence unleashed by Europe in its encroachment in Africa. There can be no question about that. But that has a historicity and has a deep history. Violence that highlights the Janus face is at the core of modern life. But this representation also flattens and condenses a complex past that grants Europe far too much power. For Africa, Africans in the African diaspora, the stakes are considerable. Concepts like tradition, authenticity, autonomy, cultural memory, agency, and resistance, which always acquired valence through analogy and negation in the wake of encounters, cannot be conceived in their complexity until the historical specificity of the European past is clarified. As a post-colonial historical intervention, but also a history that acknowledges the complex entanglement with Africa and Africans in the making of European social formation, I point here to the need for an elaboration of an earlier European past as a necessary condition for writing histories of both the early modern and contemporary African diaspora. In present-day Ghana, Elmina to be exact, long before Ashanti ascendancy, or the earlier and even earlier Anlo Ewe arrival, an African lord approached a group of recently landed strangers. In a magical landscape inhabited by gods, royalty, the living and the dead, the majesty of form engendered through coronations, processions, sound, and sacred rituals constituted far more than a minor affair. At that moment, which the Portuguese associated with 1481, but whose reckoning for local Africans remains obscured in distinct cultural configurations of the past. The Lord encountered the largest contingent of Europeans ever to set foot in the land of Guinea. Specifically, the Portuguese called the land jutting into the Atlantic on which they hoped to erect a fort so as to secure access to the inland gold trade, El Mina, literally the mine. As he greeted the strangers, the Caramansa, back to this earlier narrative, the Caramansa made clear that he held their lives in his hands, but also enacted his omnipotence over the local inhabitants. Hours earlier, the Portuguese commander Diego de Azambuja had pressed his factor both to secure permission to land, and for an audience with the reigning lord, whose title was Caramansa, though the Portuguese initially mistook that to be his name. And for those of you who are working on Islamic texts, you understand that this is also Caramansa, it's spelled with an M-A-Z-A, but it also comes from the Islamic term from Mansa in terms of for those of you who are working on Mali and other places like Mali and Sanghain, in that tradition, the Islamic tradition, it would be like Mansa, like an emperor, like an M-A-N-S-A. Now the new arrivals stood in formation awaiting their lord Caramansa, even if De Azambuja extended the request as a routine formality. His gesture of requesting permission, especially in view of the larger contingent of Christians present, acknowledged Caramansa's dominion. After decades of fleeting contact, sovereigns from Mina and those whose dominion extended to West Africa and to the West African and West Central African coast, still demanded respect for their position as lords and landlords. Respect that the Portuguese accorded. Diplomacy in the form of discernible gestures and motions facilitated trade and implicated the Portuguese in local kingship rituals directed at them and local subjects. As a result of securing diplomatic recognition, one contemporary noted that African sovereigns allowed the Portuguese to carry on their business, quote, their business in peace and friendliness without those warlike incursions, assaults and robberies which happened at the very beginning, end quote. As the Portuguese awaited Caramansa's arrival, the cacophony of bugles and bells and horns announced the Lord's procession. Surrounded by an armed escort and accompanied by nobles, each trailed by two naked pages carrying their rulers' stools and weapons, the Caramansa approached with measured poise. The Portuguese chronicler Rui de Penha recounted how the king came naked and his arms and legs were covered with chains and trinkets of gold in many shapes, and countless bells and large beads of gold were hanging from the hair of his beard and his head, end quote. As the king reached the center of the company, Diego de Azambuja descended from his makeshift platform. Again, a platform that had actually been fully constructed with Portuguese timber and Portuguese nails by Portuguese carpenters who actually came into Urcas, right? Because they couldn't actually touch, appropriate, possess any of those things there without violating the sovereignty of Caramansa. So every caravel was accompanied by a ship, a supply ship. For much of the first century, he reverently approached the Lord, who took his hand only to release it so as to touch his fingers and then snap the one with the other, saying in his language, Beri Beri, which in ours means peace, peace. De Azambuja understood what was required of him and responded with a gesture of his own. The African lords accompanying the king repeated the hand-finger ritual of their lord. But recall Ruy de Peña, the manner in which they snapped their fingers differed from that of the king. Wetting their fingers in their mouths and wiping them on their chest, they cracked them from little finger to index finger, a kind of salute here given to princes, for they say that fingers can carry poison if they are not cleaned in this manner. End quote. Following this series of gestures, principals on both sides extolled rhetoric of goodwill and friendship, but also warnings. If the Portuguese acted contrary to his will, proclaimed the king, quote, they would cause more harm to themselves than him, end quote. With this stern warning, the Caramansa conveyed what one aspect of the rituals dramatized. As sovereign authority, he wielded power over life and death. As sources of authority, spectacles conveyed the mysteries of power embedded in lordship. Regardless of how mesmerizing the finger snapping might be to those of us schooled in the way of streetwise and complex handshakes, fist and shoulder bumps, trivializing symbolic enactments, if not overlooking them, altogether as scholars of Atlantic history have done in relationship to Africa, results in a distorted geography of power. If we don't understand what those gestures meant, and if we don't actually make an effort to understand what those gestures meant, then we are very quick to just simply go to the pattern of serialization. We want data in numbers. We want to understand the slave trade and how many came and were taken, as opposed to understanding the rituals that also created the space and were accompanied by a soundscape that I believe many of you are engaged in your work. In the history of the early modern African-European encounter at African Atlantic Studies and the history of the African diaspora, rarely do symbolized enactments in Africa figure as sites for theorizing about the early history of sovereign power. The spectacles enacted along Africa's Atlantic coast during the 15th century and beyond suggest that the region constituted a crucial site in which lordship and sovereignty came into being, not simply existed, but also came into being as process, as something that was being made. Spectacles and ceremonies of encounters along with ceremonies of possession repeatedly dramatized sovereignty while displaying authority over sacred knowledge, territory, and mostly people. In the 15th century, an African lord's loci of power invariably centered on the ability to marshal vassals and retainers whose fortune, status, and debts, ties or lack thereof, triggered the calculus that transformed subjects into slaves. Right? And I think that's still a thing that we have to be theorizing and working with at all times. That encounter is not already foreordained for us as a racial encounter, and for that matter, one in which it's an encounter in which the enslaved Africans were already slaves before they became enslaved Africans. Focusing on the early modern spectacles and ceremonies recalibrates the locus of Atlantic encounters while bringing forth new domains for examining both the history of sovereignty but also the taxonomies of difference that engendered who was a subject of an African lord and therefore could not be enslaved, as opposed to who was simply a slave and could be acquired by Europeans. At one level, then, I'm interested in tacking, literally, and archiving performances of lordship, the ceremonies and pomp symptomatic of early modern practices of statecraft or sovereignty in which Africans figured. Here, the mystery of power, authority, and rule resided in incantations of rituals and rites, generally overlooked in the secular conceptions of power that since the 18th century have framed representations of the African-European encounter. And these expressions are generally reduced to cultural traditions by the scholars that do focus on them. That was a mouthful, and I just want to be just very clear about what I'm saying here, is that it's not to say that our story about power for all encounters on a global scale are reduced to the secular. I'm saying that in our story of the European-African encounter, that particular encounter already has a secular valence that reduces it to the point that forecloses other ways of thinking, conceptualizing. And so that then when we have this kind of secular valence that is imposed, what happens then is that those who focus on the cultural traditions, what they're doing is actually reading those cultural traditions in a very kind of, in a sense that says these are traditions and curiosities that can be marginalized rather than being placed at the center of the historical narrative, at the center of the encounter, as the center of our thinking of what constitutes the political. It is also for you, hopefully, an opportunity to think with, to sort of say that what we are doing, what you are doing, is in fact not marginal, but at the center of the story, of the very story of this encounter. And yet, there are more than simple manifestations of cultural performances devoid of politics. Flourishing at the moment of contact, these spectacles, even in the 15th century, reflect hybrid cultural forms composed of novel terminology, pidgin languages, currencies, sacred knowledges, and rituals. These are not just cultural effects, but instruments of power. The spectacles were in fact staged for both European consumption and the subjects of an African lord, intent on asserting autonomy in the juridical and economic periphery. In this respect, the Caramansa's opening performance constituted a multi-sided ceremony. First, the African lord focused the Europeans' gaze on his authority. Then the Portuguese directed the performance at themselves and other Christians at a distance. By these actions, the Lord marshaled not just the attention of the Portuguese, but that of his subjects, while asserting his dominion, whereby charting a new locus of sovereignty from that wielded by established lords inland, right? So there's a way in which this is the story of the coast. This is the story of the encounter, but it's not just simply that. It's also, it lingers, and it also gives us a glimpse that there's a way in which there's an African story there that is not just about what's going on in relationship to the arrival of these new strangers, of these Europeans, but it's also a way of breaking away from other kinds of forms of authority that are inland, right? That are inland, that play a considerable role, and I think that we have to be thinking about those at the same time. We therefore need to see the encounter engendering a spatial reconfiguration of power that eventually led to the emergence of new breakaway polities whose origins and cultural logic resided principally in the expanding Atlantic complex. These moments, along with their assertions of absolute and legitimate authority, sovereignty that is, need to be reintegrated into the history of the encounter and into the political history of both African and European states. The earliest encounters between Africans and Europeans, in other words, embodied more than an aberrant yet overlooked moment in the long history of the slave trade. Just give me a few more minutes and we're just going to wrap up here. In an age marked by discoveries, encounters, and conquests, the performative, discursive, and material foundations of power, the collective locus of sovereignty, structured the way that lords and subjects, Africans and Europeans interacted. Expansion in the form of discoveries, encounters, and conquest brought distinct manifestations of power and by implications various forms of sovereignty into relief. These diverse traditions emerged during encounters when those who embodied sovereign power in their relationship to the occult, in their regulation of legitimate violence, in their dominion over people, or in their control over territory, insist on being understood on their own respective terms. The resulting dynamic, acts of translations, configures the way in which power both comprised and suffused the social landscape. The autonomy of power, the anatomy of power, that is not the autonomy of power, but the anatomy of power has occupied a vast array of thinkers, but philosophically and historically, its form and formation have always been exclusively framed in a manner privileging the Western experience. Even the language for discerning power in non-Western and culturally hybrid context draws narrowly on a decidedly modern Western European experience. And here we should note, for instance, that the modern classical expression of power, which the German social theorist Max Weber saw as the state embodying a monopoly of violence, continues to wield hegemonic influence over our theoretical imaginary. Formulated as a general definition of the state and its role in framing the modern experience, subsequent writers have had few philosophical qualms about projecting Weber's analytics of power into the past. Rather than taking issue here with the anachronism of projecting a modern entity as the universal embodiment of state form, I wish to simply direct our attention to the purported monopoly over power. Weber's definition, though mindful of a contested terrain, contends that the viability of the state rests on its ability to exercise hegemony over competing forms of power. The state, we are told, exerts force exclusively in its domain. If that were the case, and in fact the case, one must still ask, what are the analytical implications for sites of encounters and where authorities and lords on both sides stood face to face? Are we to assume that such sites lacked a monopoly over violence? Posed differently, should we configure power at the moment? How should we configure power at the moment and site of the encounter? By insisting on the coevalness and mutual constituency of sovereign authority in early modern Africa and Iberian imperial absolutism, I argue for a wider Atlantic African terrain on which power must be theorized, one that brings into relief the way writers have naturalized the history of political practice in Africa and Europe as mutually exclusive phenomenon. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thanks.
Oh, no, please stay. Oh, stay. You stay here, yes. I just wanted to, please, here, thank you. Thanks deeply for this enlightening lecture, reminding us the power of words and the word of power. And, but that is really an amazing opening for this conference. I would say that really give us lots of food for thought about the relationship that there is between the way we describe things and the way we live things, and the way we describe them make us them living them differently, actually. So thank you again for this presentation. We normally do not open the floor for questions, but I'm sure that many of you has many burning questions they want to ask to our guest, and therefore we will invite you later to join us at the cocktail to ask those questions, because everything is better with a glass of wine. But before that, the last bit of ceremonial activity here. I invite here on the central stage Madame Betsabe Haas, deputizing for the mayor of Tours in this occasion. It is in fact custom for the town of Tours to offer the Medal of the City to the open keynote speaker of the Grand Colloque. J'invite maintenant à me rejoindre Madame Betsabe Haas, adjointe du maire, qui représentera Monsieur le maire de Tours, en fait. Il est tradition que le maire de Tours donne la médaille de la ville de Tours au chercheur qui nous fait l'honneur d'ouvrir les grands colloques internationaux d'études humanistes. Je vous laisse la parole.
Merci Madame la directrice. On est très très heureux ici à Tours d'avoir le privilège, je dois dire, l'immense privilège d'avoir ce colloque qui nous parle d'histoire, qui nous parle aussi de réconcilier des visions historiques qui ont souvent été montrées comme binaires. Et vraiment, je vous remercie d'avoir montré toute cette complexité. En tout cas, when I listened to you, I ended up thinking Africa was rich, and Europe was poor at that time. It sounded like that. So I just want to say that I remember reading Howard Zinn, and I remember his quote saying that the rabbits would never have history as such as long as the hunters would write the history of the rabbits. And I think that the work you're doing today is exactly that, putting forward into the light what has been and what has been constitutive of our relationships today with Africa and African culture. I also want to say, as a musician, since I am a musician, how touched I was, especially that I sing a lot of early music, about discovering that, of course, I knew from Jordi Savall and Montserrat Figueras, all that has been done around music from Africa. But today it felt really something special. So really thank you. And also thank you because we need empowerment, we need pride, we need to know better so that people of African origins can be proud of themselves, of their origins, of their culture, or the cultures of their fathers and mothers, and say that today in Europe it has never been so important, and now I speak as a politician, that I am also. I represent also the region, I have to say today, Mr. François Bonneau, the president of the region, and say that we are at that time that is very scary. We had elections, everybody has followed that, and we've seen the extreme right rising a lot. And with this, all these ideas of racism, of superiority of white race over the others. And I think that what we are doing today, what you have made possible, is extremely important for the vitality of democracy in Europe. And I think Africa has to be also leading the way towards these new vision of democracy and sharing this knowledge. I think really we need it. We are desperate, actually. So thank you so much. This is my time. I've never done that before. So, Sir Bennett, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you for your profound words and for your very generous words, but more importantly, for the profundity of what you just said, of how important what we can and need to be doing at this particular moment. Our work is, in many ways, about the past, but if we only think of our work as only having relevance just for the past, we lose sight of the important mission of the humanities, that the humanities is foundational to our democracies. And so this work that we do is about recovering certain understandings, of making sure that people understand beauty and aesthetics and the sublime. But the sublime is also foundational to how we live our lives as civic creatures. And so I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank the Deputy Mayor for reminding us of that connection, that the humanities are at the core of our democratic values. Thank you. I can take questions. Is that what you want to say?
No.
Oh.
we just wanted to know if they wanted to add anything, but apparently we do not, and we just invite you to join the Sherpas, the local expert of the sites that will lead you toward the CESR, where cold sparkling wine and other amenities is waiting for you. Thank you again for this insightful and profound presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.